The Yemeni army launches an all-out military campaign to destroy al-Qaeda bases on its territory. Is it another war by proxy? Is Yemen in danger of becoming a failed state, with the government fighting on 3 fronts at the same time? Or is the government using the war on terror to crush all opposition and rebel movements in the country? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hud Abdelhamid. Yemen steps up its campaign against al-Qaeda in the country. Over the last 2 weeks, Yemeni officials claim to have killed at least 68 al-Qaeda members and arrested 30 others. The latest attack was on Thursday in the eastern province of Shabwa. The Yemeni government says that airstrike claimed at least 30 suspected militants, including 2 senior figures. But dozens of civilians have also been hurt and killed. In recent months, al-Qaeda has carried out frequent attacks in Yemen. Officials said the militants had allegedly been planning more. Al-Qaeda's activities in Yemen have never really abated since the late 90s. The U.S. got involved in Yemen's fight against al-Qaeda after its warship, the USS Cole, was targeted by the group in 2000. This was followed by a number of attacks on foreign interests and nationals in the country, including one outside the U.S. Embassy that killed 16 people last September. Recently, American officials said the country is becoming a reserve base or safe haven for the terrorist network. The U.S. has invested some $70 million in military aid in Yemen over the past year, mostly for training, intelligence, and the use of American drones. Earlier this month, the government said the United States has offered to help Yemen in its fight against terrorism. The announcement followed a letter from President Barack Obama to his Yemeni counterpart, Ali Abdullah Saleh, in which he said, "The United States will stand beside Yemen, its unity, security and stability. Al-Qaeda is a common threat, dangerous to everyone, and America will adopt an initiative to help Yemen face development challenges and support reform efforts." Al-Qaeda's presence in Yemen is believed to be supported by a Sunni fundamentalist movement who has gained a foothold among Yemen's tribes. This while popular anger has increased against the rule of President Ali Abdullah Saleh, who has been in power for 30 years. Well, joining us today to discuss this further, from Sana'a we have Abdullah al-Faquih. He's a Yemeni political analyst. From Beirut, Bernard Hakel, professor of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University. And from Washington, D.C., Laura Kasinoff, a Sana'a-based journalist on Yemeni affairs. Ms. Abdullah al-Faquih, let me start with you. There have been 2 military operations over the past 2 weeks. Why now? Doesn't the government have enough on its plate with the rebellions in both the north and the south?
Why now? I think there are 2 reasons for that. First of all, Al-Qaeda's threat to the country has risen, to the #1 threat in the past few months. Not only to Yemen, but also, to neighboring countries and to the international community. And as the instability deepens in the north, in the south, and in the middle of the country, the Al-Qaeda has been able, to raise its position and has been able, to capture officers, intelligence officers, and hold them for several months and try them, convict them, and execute them in a clear challenge to state sovereignty. They have also been able to send operatives, to neighboring countries to carry out terrorist attacks. They have come to the street to speak to rallies in a clear challenge, to the state. They have been carrying, many terrorist operations on low scale, within the country. I think there is also the second reason for why now is because the U.S. and the international community, feel strongly about, the threat of Al-Qaeda, and there have been, pressures on the Yemeni government along the way to act. The challenge for all is how to sustain, these acts against Al-Qaeda, because with Al-Qaeda you cannot just hit Al-Qaeda and then go fishing as the Yemeni government usually does.
Well, Bernard Hakel, I mean, U.S. officials are saying that basically Yemen has become the new regional base for al-Qaeda, and are also suggesting that some operatives are traveling from Iraq, from Pakistan, from Afghanistan to Yemen. Is there any proof of that?
Oh, there's no question that al-Qaeda has created a base for itself in Yemen, and they publish an online journal or magazine, and many statements have been coming out of Yemen for the last few years to show that, in fact, and indeed, Yemen has become a base for them from which they seek to unseat and destabilize Saudi Arabia. That's their principal goal. It's true what the earlier speaker has said, that they have attacked the Yemeni government in various ways, but their principal target is and has been the Saudi government. And there's no question that there is pressure on the Yemeni government to deal with this problem. And I think the United States, especially with President Obama, who favors the use of drone attacks, has seen it as a very good place to continue this policy, which he practices in Pakistan.
So, Laura Kasidov, could we then suggest that actually Yemen has come under intense international pressure from both the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, and is really carrying out these attacks for them somehow?
I think that's very much a contributing factor in Yemen's in these recent attacks that have been launched against al-Qaeda, and in the past in the Yemeni government's efforts, to sort of we hit the base of extremism in the country. It's definitely because of outside pressure from the United States government in particular, I believe.
Well, Mr. Abdullah al-Faqih, I mean, these attacks have also been costly for the civilians. Now, isn't that kind of collateral damage actually going to backfire, in the sense that we have seen in the past in other countries, like Iraq, for example, that each time there was collateral damage, al-Qaeda found more popular support in those areas?
Absolutely. Airstrikes are not the way to go about al-Qaeda in Yemen, because al-Qaeda in Yemen is blinded into communities, and you cannot go after one and then kill 60 people. That way you push the civilians towards al-Qaeda, and makes it easier for al-Qaeda to recruit youths and other Yemenis. So that's why, the international community and the Yemeni government had to build a strong partnership to do work on the ground, to chase al-Qaeda from city to city, from door to door. That's the way to go about it. But if they repeat, the U.S. strategy in Afghanistan, where you kill, civilians, and in many instances you even miss any al-Qaeda, target, that will not work in Yemen. In Yemen, we need a sustainable work, a continuous effort against al-Qaeda, where the Yemeni government and the international community work together on this on the ground and not from the sky.
Well, Bernard Hakel, following these attacks, there has been a public outcry, both because of the civilian casualties and also because of U.S. involvement on Yemen territory. So in the likelihood we see more of these attacks, is it that the government is going to find itself isolated even by those Yemenis who actually don't really support al-Qaeda?
I think you raise a very important point. Look, Yemen has many problems, and al-Qaeda is only just one of them. Yemen is on the verge of becoming a failed state like Somalia, and is facing a number of challenges, some political and some environmental, if you like. The political challenges are an insurgency in the north, a brewing insurgency in the south. You have a demographic problem, endemic poverty in the country, and corruption. And in addition, you have declining oil revenues as well as a water supply that's running out. So the country is really on the verge of the abyss. And the question to ask is whether pursuing a policy of targeted attacks with drones is actually going to help stabilize the country or actually make it worse off. And my instinct is to say that these kinds of attacks are actually not the right way to go about things, and that the government in Yemen, in Sana'a at the moment, has to be dealt with very carefully. The United States, and especially Saudi Arabia, have to go in, for example, and try to broker a deal with the northerners, the Houthis in the north, so that that situation is stabilized and that war ends before really Al-Qaeda is properly tackled.
Well, Laura Kasinoff, I mean, you have been in Yemen many times. How much support does the president have in his fight against Al-Qaeda at the moment?
In his fight against Al-Qaeda, I mean, it depends where you're talking in Yemen. I mean, in the south, certainly the population has many grievances with the government, you know, some legitimate, some illegitimate. And I mean, there I would say there's very little support for the government's fight against Al-Qaeda. You know,
but is there popular support then among Yemenis for Al-Qaeda?
If I can interject.
You know, in the South, I think that, you know, there's a certain idea that the Southern separatist movement and Al-Qaeda have a common enemy, and so thus they may work together. I mean, there's many people throughout the country outside of Sana'a have grievances with the central government, and even though they may not adhere to this, you know, the ideology of, you know, certain jihadist ideology, I believe that sort of the common enemy is it unites many of the various insurgencies in Yemen with the Al-Qaeda movement.
Okay, Bernard Hakel, you wanted to add something on this.
Yeah, I mean, I personally don't think that the Houthis, for instance, in the north, who are Shi'is, would ever work with Al-Qaeda. And I think that the Southerners also would shy away from collaborating with Al-Qaeda just because of Al-Qaeda comes with a lot of baggage. Not to mention, for instance, a lot of the Southerners are actually socialists or communists, and so it wouldn't work with Al-Qaeda at all. But the thing to keep in mind is that in Yemen, you have a very religious and traditional society that has a long history of having sent men to Afghanistan to fight the Soviet Union in the 1980s. So there's a long history of people being ideologized and given propaganda to fight non-Muslims who are occupying Muslim land. At the time in the 80s, it was the Soviets. Today, it's the Americans in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So you have a population that is willing to subscribe to the larger political aims of Al-Qaeda, namely that Muslims should not be occupied. Now, whether they would actually join tactically with Al-Qaeda, I doubt it. Most Yemenis would not want to see suicide bombings on their streets and so on. But there is sympathy there for this movement that is fighting American occupation.
Observers say the latest attack against Al-Qaeda in Yemen is taking place in coordination with Saudi Arabia, who is now helping fight the Houthis, but feel that the real threat comes from Al-Qaeda in Yemen. In January of this year, Saudi and Yemeni branches of Al-Qaeda announced their merger into Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, attracting followers from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia, and Saudi Arabia. In March, a senior Al-Qaeda member confirmed in a televised confession that the group is using Yemen as a base to attack the kingdom. 5 months later, an Al-Qaeda suicide bomber tried to kill Saudi Prince Mohammed bin Nayef, the anti-terror chief. The mobber, who was on the Saudi list of most wanted militants, had entered the kingdom from Yemen. The Saudis believe that the presence of Al-Qaeda in Yemen is a direct threat for the kingdom. So, Mr. Abdullah al-Faqih, is there Saudi pressure on Yemen to eradicate Al-Qaeda in any possible way? And is Saudi maybe playing the money card in the sense it will offer financial help to the Yemeni government in return of its fight against Al-Qaeda?
I think the Saudis are very worried about Al-Qaeda in Yemen, and to see their troops, you know, mobilized, I mean, to the borders, is to expect the Saudis to take part in operations against Al-Qaeda. Of course, the attacks of the past 2 weeks have been carried out in the south, but Al-Qaeda is real, I mean, castle is to the northeast. basically on the borders of Saudi Arabia. So I would expect the Saudis, I mean, and the Yemeni government, and probably the U.S., because the U.S. can really, I mean, play a significant role in terms of planning, providing technical assistance, and also, you know, in intelligence. So we expect, I mean, a lot of things to happen in the fight with Al-Qaeda. If that doesn't happen, then we are running into many risks. Al-Qaeda can strike back hardly on the Yemeni government, especially with the government busy fighting in the north, and of course, you know, repressing, you know, protesters in the south, and of course, you know, and concerned with the economy. So the Yemeni government is facing too many challenges to expect it, I mean, to be able, I mean, to focus on Al-Qaeda, you know, for a long time. We have seen in the past the Yemeni government, you know, bring the issue of Al-Qaeda to the agenda for a short period of time, and then soon drops it out from the agenda.
Okay, so
we need that dynamics to change. I mean.
Okay, so Bernard Haeckel, now does this put in question the vision of President Obama that the fight against Al-Qaeda is a fight that happens in Afghanistan and along the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan?
Absolutely. I mean, if I may just say one word about Saudi Arabia, your earlier question, I have one small thing to say, which is that historically the Saudi policy towards Saudi Arabia, towards Yemen, which is always handled by the Crown Prince, Prince Sultan bin Abdulaziz, has been to keep Yemen, the central government in Yemen, weak. And right now, you have a change in policy, or at least a realization that a change in policy is needed, namely that you need a very strong central government in Sana'a, not a weak one, to be able to tackle all these multiple problems that Yemen is facing. Now, to come to your second question to do with President Obama, the problem with President Obama's policy is that he's focused almost exclusively on the war in Afghanistan. And he thinks that by defeating the Al-Qaeda in the Afghanistan and in the areas of Pakistan, the problem will be solved. I mean, that's how it's being presented to the American public. And in fact, I think that's mistaken. It shows that the strategy in Afghanistan, the U.S. strategy in Afghanistan, is not clear-headed, but rather muddled, and that the problem of Al-Qaeda is not one that can be contained in one or two countries, but rather has to be tackled in any number of countries. In Somalia, for instance, with the Shabab movement, in Yemen, where it's now presently located with this united Saudi and Yemeni Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, in Iraq, and in the Maghreb, and a number of other places. So the problem of Al-Qaeda will not be solved militarily alone by sending more troops to Afghanistan.
Well, Laura Kassinov, now do you think there is a realization in Washington that maybe just limiting the fight of Al-Qaeda to Afghanistan and Pakistan might really backlash?
Yes, I think so. I mean, in the past months, we've definitely seen an increase in rhetoric from the U.S. government, just talking more and more about Yemen as a potential new Al-Qaeda haven. You know, they're really, I mean, might be a couple years late, but they're really, you know, they're really realizing this now, and a lot of senior U.S. officials have visited Yemen in the past couple months. So I think Washington definitely is starting to realize this, but I mean, as Mr. Faqih mentioned earlier, I believe that, you know, the way the U.S. government is going about this and going about going after Al-Qaeda in Yemen with these targeted attacks, you know, it might not be the best policy. You know, tackling things like development and tackling corruption within the government and just increasing the legitimacy of Yemen's government. You know, these things like that definitely will go a long way in increasing the spread of jihadist ideology in Yemen. But the answer is yes. I think the U.S. government has become aware. I mean, President Obama sent a letter to President Saleh a few months ago saying exactly this. You know, the U.S. government is continuing to cooperate with Yemen on issues of counterterrorism.
And Mr. Abdullah al-Faqih, I mean, how do you think would the Yemeni public react to such U.S. pressure?
Well, it depends. I think the pressure, I mean, needs to come not only on Al-Qaeda, but also on other conflicts. the war in Saudi is a source of instability in Yemen and a major, breeding for Al-Qaeda. The protests in the south and the instability, is similar, to that. The Yemenis are now different from they used to be. I think there have been, a change in the public opinion. The elite is now more receptive, to a positive rule. President Obama is really very well liked, at least until, 2 weeks ago. So I think the U.S. really needs to play a role. This all depends on the U.S. ability to engage with Yemen, not only in airstrikes but also on the ground in economic issues, in the conflict in the south, in the conflict in the north. Because I agree with Mr. Haykel that you cannot go after Al-Qaeda in Yemen unless you bring to an end the conflict in the north and the conflict in the south, because these two conflicts I do have the possibility of producing other terrorist networks of their own, if they go on unchecked.
Well, Mr. Bernard Haykel, just briefly, now, obviously, Yemen is fighting two other wars at the same time, in the south and in the north. Do you think there's some sort of trade-off here, whereas, the cooperation with the U.S. against Al-Qaeda gives the president and the military a green light to deal the way they wish with those two other fronts?
I think that the president in Yemen is probably hoping that if he allows Al-Qaeda to be attacked, that he will get more support from the United States to deal with the Houthis in Saada and perhaps with the people in the south. But that's really not something that the United States should encourage at all. There is no military solution to either the Houthi rebellion in the north or to the southern movement of separation. These are political problems that have to be tackled politically, not militarily.
So, and my last word will go to a question to Abdullah al-Faqih. Now, obviously, there is military help and cooperation at the moment between Yemen and the U.S., but, as we have seen in the past, it has backfired, especially in this region. Shouldn't the U.S. push before everything for reform by the government?
I do think so. And before reform, I agree with Mr. Haykel that the conflict in the north must be, brought to an end immediately and not later. The same thing, with the conflict in the south. I think the U.S. should pressure all parties to sit around a table and to discuss the political, differences among them. And that's the start for reform. There is no other way. If that happens, then the U.S. can play a positive role against Al-Qaeda. The Yemenis, all the Yemenis will support their government and will welcome, U.S. interference in against Al-Qaeda. I don't think Al-Qaeda is in a position of being supported, in stable areas in Yemen. Actually, many Yemenis, like in the northeast or in the south, are, asking Al-Qaeda to leave. But again, we have to solve problems.
Okay, we have reached the end of our program. I'd like to thank our guests in Sana'a, Abdullah al-Faqih, in Beirut, Bernard Haykel, and in Washington, D.C., Laura Kasinoff. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye for now.